Hi, everybody. Welcome to COVID Conversation Series, a Black Lives Initiative. We're streaming live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. My name is Lana James, and thank you for joining us for today's session, Data, Algorithms, Automation as Weapons of Math Destruction, a mathematician's insights into the implications of AI for equity and universal healthcare. We begin, as usual, with our land acknowledgement, followed by a moment of silence. Then I will provide a brief overview of today's session and some background information. So I'm going to begin now, the land acknowledgement. And for those of you who are used to joining us, this means that you sit as comfortably as you can, or stand or lay as comfortably as you can, and close your eyes if you're open to that, so that you can kind of ground yourself and join us today and get settled in. Okay. We'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered today, and by acknowledging the caretakers of this land. This is the land of the Treaty of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, Chippewa, Huron-Wendat nations. Listening and reciting land acknowledgements is an important action. However, ending settler colonialism, its discriminatory institutions, vehicles of knowledge production, and white supremacy that it thrives on are equally as important. I ask you, what are you doing today to end occupation? This moment demands more than acknowledging our settler colonial history in this country. Some of us have been brought to stolen land as stolen people. Others of us have recently arrived. So I ask each and every one of you to do more than just think about it and to act on it. Here at Ready for Black Lives Initiatives, every act that we take hopefully moves us closer in our intentions and our actions towards decolonization. We will now take a moment of silence. For those of you that are new, that are joining us, we take a moment of silence in recognition of the struggles that are going on globally, not just here at home, in the United States, in Brazil, in the UK, across Central and South America, all across the world, China, in Melanesia, Oceania, Australia. Black people, people of color, and Indigenous peoples are fighting for their lives. And so in this moment, we recognize those who are living with disabilities, those who are struggling with refugee status at borders, those who have been forgotten, as well as those who are over-policed and who lose their lives in the presence of police who are supposed to preserve and protect. So in this moment, I ask you to take time and several deep breaths as we hold this moment of silence. One more deep breath. Okay. And so there might be a little bit of background noise. Hopefully you're not picking that up. And as we move from a moment of silence, now we're going to revisit the event description just so that we can recap what we're about to review today. So our session is Data, Algorithms, and Automation as Weapons of Math Destruction, a mathematician's insights into the implications of AI for equity and universal healthcare. Mathematician Cathy O'Neil will explain in plain language the way that data, algorithms, and automation function together to exploit individuals and communities. During this session, Cathy O'Neil and I will explore mounting reports of data grabs by various actors during the pandemic and investigate who's to benefit and how. We will also outline data laws and potential regulations that will help limit the exploitation of personal health information. For those of you that are not from Canada or from the province of Ontario, we will be using that as a case study example. We will also outline um, the thought experiment that Cathy will undertake so that we can look at the real costs of insufficient data protections and demonstrate why patients, researchers, administrators, clinicians, and policymakers need to be proactive in protecting people's data. Before we move into the background that's needed for the thought experiment, I'd like to share Cathy's bio. Cathy earned her PhD in math from Harvard, was a postdoc at MIT Math Department, and a professor at Barnard College, where she published a number of research papers in in arithmetic algebraic geometry. She then switched over to the private sector, working as a quant for the hedge fund D.E. Shaw in the middle of the credit crisis, and then for Risk Metrics, a risk software company that assesses the risk for the holdings of hedge funds and banks. She left finance in 2011 and started working as a data scientist in New York and start in the New York startup scene, building models that predicted people's purchases and clicks. She wrote Doing Data Science in 2013 and launched the lead program in data journalism at Columbia in 2014. She's a regular contributor to Bloomberg View and wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. She recently founded Orca, an algorithmic auditing company. Kathy,
Hi.
hey, I just wanted to give you a chance to say hi to the folks before I go into providing the background for the Vice article that you'll be using for your thought experiment. So this is Cathy O'Neil, and I'm going to give you, as the audience, some excerpts from the Vice article. The link to the article will show up in the chat. So if you want to follow along, you can. I'm going to be reading big chunks so that everybody's on the same page, so that as Kathy talks, you can be well grounded. So the title of the article is called A Crime Fighting Police Tech Accelerator in Edmonton Has Activists Worried. A partnership, and I'm going to just start with the beginning of the article. It's by Nathan Munn, and this is a Vice article. And the title again is A Crime Fighting Police Tech Accelerator in Edmonton Has Activists Worried. A partnership between police, venture capitalists, and big business want to solve crime and social problems with technologies. Activists and experts say it's not that simple. Police in Edmonton, I'm citing directly from the article, police in Edmonton have partnered with venture capitalists to fund tech entrepreneurs to come up with solutions to crime and social problems using sensitive data collected from healthcare systems, social services, and police. Edmonton Police Service Chief and venture capitalist, who is also the chair of the Edmonton Police Foundation, say the goal of the Community Solutions Accelerator, the CSA, is to save public money by privately funding entrepreneurs to address tough problems such as addictions and homelessness. They also say the accelerator will help businesses create products to be used by police and social services in the field, such as artificial intelligence. The CSA will then sell products to other cities. Going further into the article, it quotes, to help startups bring these and other ideas to life, the CSA will pool sensitive information about Albertans from healthcare, child welfare, social services, and policing databases and provide it to entrepreneurs to get creative. The venture capitalist says, quote, the most sensitive data will only be handled by police, who will anonymize the data before giving it to businesses. However, the article goes on to say activists and privacy experts say the accelerator, launched in February 2020 without much fanfare, will affect the lives of vulnerable communities. And I'd like to just jump to the end of the article, and you're welcome to read it there. Brendan McPhail of the CCLA states, quote, private businesses are not subject to the same level of scrutiny as public institutions. And police services and businesses have different priorities that can be difficult to reconcile, experts say. She goes on to point out that not only do we need to be mindful, but she states, quote, police have a particular duty to the people they are paid to protect. We grant them exceptional powers, which is definitely the case during the COVID pandemic, and their use of powers we grant must be accountable. Businesses, on the other hand, are accountable to their bottom line. It's a very tricky balance to ensure public accountability. And those are the words. We're closing on the article by Brenda McPhail, and that article was published on June 3rd, 2020, written by Nathan Munn and published by Vice. So we're going to get into this, Kathy. One of the things that's been really clear at the feedback we've gotten from people who have written in, asked questions, sent comments is, can you give us some applied examples of what's possible? Because so often they're sold the hype and the marketing of what AI can do and machine learning, and we just got to throw some variables in there, throw some data in there, and poof, you're going to get great interventions. But
Yeah.
often the downside is completely overlooked, if not minimized, and taken completely out of view. This is a concern, especially in a country where we've spent trillions of dollars of public investment to maintain a single payer shared insurance health system that now, as we can see, venture capitalists can get in on without any investment. So tell us a little bit about your love of thought experiments and the one you're going to take us through.
Yeah, thanks so much. What a great introduction. I appreciate being invited here. It's an honor to be here. Yeah, so I do love thought experiments, and in part because, as many of you know, it's like actually really hard to get access to data. So that's kind of what you have available often when you're somebody who's a critic of the big data techniques. Now, having said that, like, because I did work as a quant and then as a data scientist for years, I know like the contours of the data and of the data science that goes into a lot of these things. But thought experiments actually bring you pretty far in these concepts. And most of my book, Weapons of Math Destruction, I didn't have access to an enormous amount of data. So a lot of it was like figuring out what must be happening. Having said that, it's always nice to actually have data. But yeah, so I would love to respond to the thought experiment, which is like, well, what could go wrong with that plan of putting health data in the hands of police that has been anonymized? And I basically have four critiques, four different themes, and none of them have to do with privacy. I'm not actually that concerned with privacy because, well, I guess maybe because a lot of people are, so I don't have to be. I'm much more concerned with what I'd say something is closer to something like justice, which is, I think, a really separate concept and sometimes in conflict with privacy concerns. So don't come to me for privacy concerns or like what could, because that what could go right is, as far as I'm concerned, also covered by other people much more comprehensively than me. And often I actually can't figure out what could go right in many of these situations. Anyway, so I want to give you my four critiques, my four themes that I'm going to connect back to this thought experiment, and in particular with respect to healthcare data. But before that, I want to just really quickly mention what I mean by an algorithm, because I think it's often intimidating, and I want to demystify it because it's really, really simple. At least the way I think about it. An algorithm is, what I mean by an algorithm is a predictive algorithm, and it predicts success based on historical data. So that's it. It's pattern matching, and it's like what happened in the past, we predict it'll happen in the future. It's very simple. But when I say it's always sort of predicting success. So you have to sort of define success very explicitly. And I'll come back to that in my four themes. But I just want to make it clear that we all do this all the time. We all have algorithms in our head. Like we all are like, on a day like today, I'll wear this outfit and it'll work because either it'll be comfortable or it'll keep me warm or it'll keep me, or it'll look good. You know, there's different definitions of success, and we have like different, if we have different goals in mind, we might wear different outfits. So it's not a new concept. And our historical data in that case is just like our memories. Like, oh, when I wore this outfit last time, it was uncomfortable. So if I'm going for comfort, I'm not going to wear that. If I'm going for what it looks like, maybe I will. But anyway, you have in mind a definition of success, and then you have your historical data, which is your memories. And then you're like, I want to predict what will optimize my success. That's all an algorithm does. It pattern matches from historical data. So having said that, just sort of to make it clear that algorithms are not mysterious rocket science. They are really simply pattern matching. And that's what computers do, of course, is like you give them historical data in usually digitized form, like a database, and you define very explicitly what the single definition of success is. You're not allowed to switch it up like we do with our clothing. Like for Facebook, the single definition of success is keep people on Facebook. That's it. Everything stems from that. And the question is like, what kind of thing will keep people on Facebook? Things that make people argue with each other. Anyway, so now I get to start with my four themes of what could go wrong with this thought experiment. And the first one is just propagation of inequality. And I want to caveat the rest of my critique by saying that I don't know much about Canadian healthcare. But I imagine if it's anything like American healthcare, and I know it's very different from American healthcare, but if it has commonalities, then it will not have treated all people equally, all groups of people equally. So what I just described when I defined an algorithm as pattern matching, if something was successful in the past, that it will be successful in the future, that inherently propagates past practices. It just simply says, let's keep doing what we used to do. And that is an inherent fact about predictive algorithms. It doesn't expect a new kind of answer. It expects everything to be repeated from the past. So, if people like you weren't successful in the past or weren't treated with this treatment in the past, then we will probably not treat you with this treatment in the future. If people like you got arrested a lot in the past, we'll expect you to get arrested in the future. So that's the kind of, like, as you can imagine, the data that we know about a person is demographic profiling data. So essentially what algorithms inherently do, big data algorithms, the more demographic data they're given and the more sort of socially constructed this definition of success is, the more it's just like literally a profiling machine, which it really often is, especially, well, I'm going to get to this, my fourth critique, which is like, what do we choose to turn into an algorithm and why? But anyway, so my first critique is simply that it propagates inequality. And bringing that to healthcare, it's like, to the extent that there is inequality historically, like in the United States, we have like much worse fatality for Black mothers than for white mothers. We have just an enormous amount of racism in our medical system. And like, I'm an auditor. I'm an algorithmic auditor. I actually went up to a healthcare company 2 years ago. I introduced myself. I got an appointment, introduced myself to a healthcare company that was using big data techniques and lots of healthcare data to make predictions and use it for insurance processes. And I said, yeah, what you're doing is very likely to be racist and you should check. And they're like, oh, no, we don't need to check. And then like, okay, yeah, you do. And then like there was this big article about how a healthcare company was using sort of historical data on like whose treatment cost more to predict who will get better treated in the future, and using that to decide like who deserves a sort of case manager to have help with their healthcare. And it was in fact racist. And this is almost exactly the thing I warned them about. So that's an example of what it means to propagate inequality. So it's not just a healthcare issue. Obviously, any of those different data sources that LLana mentioned that they'd be using have lots of inequality embedded into the data itself. So I mean, I didn't even spend a second on this. And I feel like this entire series has talked about this many, many times, but just in case someone's completely new, like the data itself is, of course, very curated to what we decide to collect. It's not a true reflection of a system. It's the things about the system that we choose to collect the data for. So that brings me to my second critique, which is the missingness of data. So the first thing the first thing you could sort of summarize is saying, like, the bias in the data that we have, which is biased, some people got treated better, some people had worse outcomes, et cetera, that will be propagated with algorithms. The second point I'm trying to make is, but sometimes even worse, is we just have so much missing data. The missingness is not equally distributed across different groups. And the best example here is crime. And I won't say crime data because my main point is we don't have crime data. We have what people call crime data, and I'm mostly referring to the United States, but I know this is a worldwide problem. We have Black crime data much more often than we have white crime data. So if you look, I mean, the most famous example of this crime category-wise is marijuana use, whereas Blacks and whites admit to smoking pot at the same rate. The people who get arrested are 5 times more often as Black people that get arrested than white people, the rate at which they get arrested. So what that means is, and I'm not saying that people get arrested every time they smoke pot. They often don't get arrested. Everyone knows that. In fact, I always start this, when I give this talk to a tech audience, I ask them to raise their hand if they know anyone who's ever smoked pot but then not gotten arrested afterwards. And they always laugh because they're like, haha, who gets arrested for smoking pot? Well, the answer is Black people do actually get arrested for smoking pot. And we don't have the ground, I call that ground truth, by the way, because like it is sort of the discrepancy between reality and what the data tells us, right? And the reality is people smoke pot at high rates all across the races. What data is telling us is that Black people are much more likely to smoke pot. In other words, if you like thought that the data was a reflection, a good proxy for reality, then you'd be like, wow, Black people smoke pot 5 times more often than white people. Not true. So that's the ground truth, is that there's a bias there of 5-to-1, 5-to-1 bias. And I would argue just that alone should mean that any statistician refuses to use this data in any meaningful way because it's so biased. However, that's not the case. And what we have is predictive policing, as well as downstream from that, we have these crime risk scores that inform whether someone will be held before trial, will be given parole, or will be given a longer sentence, that pretends or assumes that all of this data, this so-called crime data, which is not crime data, it's arrest data, that assumes that arrest data is a perfect proxy for actual crime. So it's not. Okay, so that's like, it's criminal, in my opinion, to pretend that that data is a good proxy for what we're pretending it is, crime. But it's a great example of this larger phenomenon that is the basis of my second critique, which is the missingness problem. We simply do not have the data in our healthcare systems consistent across different groups and different kinds of problems. And that is a problem for algorithms being useful and being fair and being just. One example I came across just yesterday was this doctor. It was a portrait in the Washington Post of a doctor, Malone Mukwende, who was a doctor that realized that his training was to recognize symptoms, especially on skin, of like light tone. And he wrote a book with other doctors on like how to look for those same diagnoses on darker skin tones. That is a very specific example, but one of many, many examples of how the system has been designed and optimized for white men. And so the missingness is not just who got the appointment, who didn't get the appointment. That's certainly missingness. And I'm sure Lana knows way more about the missingness than I do, but this is just one of the many critiques I have. But we have like just the fact that we don't have good diagnosis patterns with people of darker skin tone. So what that means is no matter what, the algorithm won't be able to be a good predictor for those minority groups. And I'll back up a little bit. I'm not saying that doctors are perfect either. And I don't want to claim that like algorithms have to be perfect before they're implemented. The problem with using algorithms instead of humans is that people often assume that they are better than people. And so what that's sort of the point I will consistently make, that we need to audit algorithms to make sure that they're at least as good as people, and to make sure that we know their blind spots, because we should just simply not go forward with using something that is actually worse, or whose blind spots we do not understand. So that's an important point to make. So those are my first two, and I don't want to spend too much time because I want questions, but I want to make two more points, and they're relatively short. The first one is that anonymization, which is one of the things that this article promises, is no panacea. In fact, it's not actually very useful. I've already explained it, but I just want to make this point really loud and clear. And this is why I am not a privacy person. This is why I get into literal fights with privacy people, which is that like, hey, you can anonymize, but if you have the gender, zip code, and race and other demographic information about the people, and then but they're anonymous. Who cares once you apply that algorithm to a specific person, especially in a asymmetrical power situation? Because once you have an asymmetrical power situation, then the person who has less power has to give up that information of their demographic, and then they're profiled by the algorithm, and then they are slotted into that like people like you situation. So I know that's a little abstract. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that there is a anonymous health risk score, which is actually a diabetes prediction tool. This exists, by the way, so it's not like a real thought experiment. It already exists, but I did have that as a thought experiment before I found that it exists. LexisNexis sells this. It's called the Socioeconomic Health Indicator, basically predicting how expensive you're going to be for medical care, and it's basically diagnosing like who's going to be likely to get diabetes. Is basically a proxy for it. It's possibly anonymous. It was possibly created anonymously, but what it does is says, demographically speaking, people like this living in Spanish Harlem or whatever, highly likely. And what that means is if you're applying for a job at a big box store and they want to know how expensive you're going to be on their healthcare, I mean, assuming they get even get benefits. By the way, I'm speaking as an American, so I'm imagining that you don't have universal healthcare and that your job is tied to your healthcare. So maybe this is not a perfect example for Canadians. But the point is that that big box store can use the LexisNexis health risk, socioeconomic health risk indicator, or whatever, whichever diabetes risk score it wants, and can pigeonhole you and can figure out your risk. I'm not saying it's perfectly accurate, but the point is that it's accurate enough to be used, and it's accurate enough in an asymmetrical power situation where you have to give up that information. It's enough to sort of say, well, you're sorry, like you're in the wrong profile to get the benefits that you deserve. And by the way, like that didn't work perfectly for Canadians, but I'll make the point that in this thought experiment for Edmonton healthcare data, they're going to give it to the police. So the police definitely have power. And that's the point. The point is that as soon as it's not a consumer situation, which I always think are bad thought experiments. Most of the situations I think are highly important and relevant are not consumer situations. They're like, I'm being judged by a system, by authority, by power. And I have to answer their questions, or I'm not going to get this job, or I'm not going to get this mortgage, or I'm not going to be set free with my constitutional rights. So the point is that algorithms, even if they're anonymized, once they're focused, laser beam focused on you, and you have to give up your data, it doesn't matter that they were anonymized because they're still going to say what you deserve based on your demographics. The final point I'll make, and then I'd love to welcome questions from Lana or from the audience, is this idea of outsourcing to private companies. Very common. And I don't know the extent to which that Canadian IP laws are different from the American IP laws, but it is unfathomable and enraging to me that even for school teachers who are civil servants paid by the public, the algorithms that were used to evaluate them and to fire them were not available to the public or to the teachers that were being fired. They were hidden. And it was like ironically called the teacher accountability movement that wasn't itself held accountable for having any statistical robustness or even information. It was essentially a random number generator. That's one of my primary examples in weapons of math destruction. But speaking like more broadly than that, IP law has allowed companies to hide behind it, saying, well, actually, let me go further. IP law has allowed government agencies and police departments and departments of education to hire third-party vendors and then say, we don't understand their algorithm. The licensing agreement doesn't allow us to understand their algorithm. But if there's a problem, it's their fault. Basically, when they outsource the data work, they're outsourcing the accountability. And that seems to actually work. So I actually consider this kind of the perfect mechanism to offload accountability. Big data techniques, like big data techniques are flawed. They're not as nearly as good as they claim to be, but because of the shield, and it's more than just IP law, it's also just the shield of like, this is complicated, you wouldn't understand this, you didn't get a PhD in math and you don't know how to read code. Like there's all sorts of levels of shield going on here, of shielding. But the shield basically means that mistakes aren't caught, complaints can't be filed, and nobody in particular is at fault when there is deep algorithmic harm. And so it's a technique, this sort of letting this private sector do our data work for us so that we don't ever have to answer for mistakes. This is a technique that which was started in the States, but is being imported to the rest of the world very quickly. So that's something to be concerned about.
So you've said a lot. So I'm just going to recap for folks that may have just jumped in because you're doing more than one thing today. So there were 4 key themes that you covered, which were very well done, and I appreciate it. Given that my PhD is in this area, the last ones you talked about, so I'll start from the bottom up, outsourcing accountability is a huge issue actually in diagnostic, in healthcare, and healthcare systems. The anonymization question, it's actually almost funny, but it's not because it's real. Here in Ontario, we've had our actual Ministry of Health under our current administration kind of dismantling our Personal Health Information Act piece by piece. And one of the interesting things that happens in that is that the power asymmetry has been exponentially magnified. And so we have this interesting concept that was introduced by this current government called the digital playbook. And if you read the digital playbook like you're a consumer, it sounds like maybe kind of a sort of good idea. But if you understand that this is a social contract between taxpayers and citizens building civil society, that digital playbook has a number of concerns that fall right in your bucket of power asymmetry issues, and rely on anonymization, which we know as a technical thing is not a real thing. And then we go to your second theme that you introduced was the missingness of data, which is an interesting issue. We have a tension, a contested space here in Canada and in Ontario, and I'll use Ontario as our case study as we talk through this, going between the Edmonton, Alberta example and Ontario, is that the missingness of data here, the answer to that is, oh, we'll just add more of your personal identifiers to unaccountable third parties who will move the data across their network, have rights to it, then do as they see fit with it. And so the answer just seems like just add more fuel to the fire, which I'm not quite sure how we're supposed to address it, because the missingness of data is really more structural. It's about what kind of proxy world have you created in the data landscape to try to mirror the real world. And if that mirroring is bringing forward 400 years of racial oppression, misogyny, and patriarchy, we need to be really careful about how we choose to fill in the missingness of data. And then to your first theme, which was the propagation of inequality, all of which are very pertinent here. Even though we have a single payer system, our single payer system has been under attack for the past 15 years. So we've seen significant delistings of services, sometimes based on age. So for instance, at one point, your ophthalmological exam was consistent across your lifespan, and then they made it only free for people of a certain age. And so we're having these rationings happen, and they're becoming more severe as we continually are pushed to the right globally into these austerity measures. So even though Canada is known for a system, this is a system that is actually in decline. So there's no intention of any government across the country to increase the health budget or to try to sustain it. We're actually in a situation for several political cycles where it's been, how do we ration, how do we ratchet it down, how do we remove? And so one of the things I wanted to just clarify for folks that are joining us now, because I know people come through their work days and are doing 2 things at once, is to kind of just bring up some other pieces around this thought experiment. So we're going to jump back to the Alberta Edmonton experiment. And one of the things that was really concerning is the idea that a venture capitalist, being that you were in the fintech sector, and I'm very familiar with it, the idea that a venture capitalist is going to hold your data and not sell it for a profit is that even a thing, Cathy? Like, my understanding of venture capital is pretty deep, and it's about profit and it's about high returns. Is that the same world that you're familiar with?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to like, I'll say something about this. And it's like both can be true
Hmm.
um, in the following sense. Look at LexisNexis. Look back to LexisNexis. They don't have to have, they're not going to sell the data that they built their by diabetes risk score algorithm on. They just need to sell the algorithm.
Yes.
So it's like, I often want to remind people of this. Like when you tell Google you have to delete everyone's, like, hey, let's make Google delete everyone's data after 6 months, that won't stop them from doing anything.
Hmm.
Even if you just say 24 hours, guess what? They update their models every night, overnight, and then they don't need that data anymore. I mean, they might keep it around just because data storage is cheap, and they might want to build another algorithm in the future, which they will need to train. But the point is that once you have a trained algorithm, you update it with new data on a daily basis, and then throw away the data. So just to just distinguish between the data and the algorithms produced by the data. So algorithms are kind of like byproducts of enormous amounts of data, but the data itself is not necessarily useful anymore. So, you know, I don't I don't want to dwell on this point, but like the VCs, even if they say, oh, it's anonymous and we don't sell the data, that doesn't mean they're not going to make a huge amount of money off of the kind of thing like a diabetes risk score, because that won't be the data and that won't, you know what I'm saying? So they'll probably get away with that because people don't quite understand how data is and is not useful.
I just wanted to read one of the comments. We're going to feed them as we go through. So we have a comment here on the screen saying, well said, Kathy, we can't assume that algorithms aren't riddled with the same biases, racist or otherwise, as the coders who develop them and the societies that they live in. These
And for
things
that
are
matter,
not separate.
the data, I mean, I would go further, like the data that was collected. You know, like the data, it's like when I'm talking about the policing, the predictive policing, like you're actually talking about the data created by the police.
Mm,
So like that isn't about the coders' biases. The coders that build the predictive policing algorithms, and I've talked to some of them, are incredibly naive and have no idea because in part because they're like well-off, educated white people. They do not know how police act except the police that they've interacted with, which has been completely a different situation. So, so it's like not. Of course, I'm not saying that the biases of the coders is irrelevant because it's not. In particular, if we had way more different kinds of people involved in the development of the software, I think that would be a better thing because we'd have more things to look for and to check before we let them be deployed in the real world. But my point is that it's a combination of the biases of the coders and of the technology companies that built it, but also the way the data was collected in the first place.
mhm. And I'm going to read one more comment before we segue back in. And it says, privacy professionals who can't intersect structural inequalities with their work around analyzing risk are therefore not analyzing risk. It should be one of the primary factors. So I think what we're looking at here is, if the structural realities that we live with, where that data is being imported, is not part of the process of assessing risk, then are they actually even doing
Yeah, I think it's
their
fair. I
job?
mean, instead of saying I'm not a privacy person, I should be like, privacy people need to like, I am a privacy person if we meet somewhere in the middle, or if we build something that's bigger than everything that we so far have. It's probably an unnecessary distinction to say privacy person or non-privacy person. There are wonderful privacy people who consider systemic issues, and I am that kind of person.
Mhm.
I
And
hope.
that's one of the reasons we have you here is because one of the challenges, having done, my reviews of the literature and spending a lot of time looking really closely at things, um, what we find is that the fact that the way data is curated is a proxy for reality seems to get lost in all the discussions of fairness, explainability, transparency, fairness. It's as if a magic trick has happened, which is somehow the curation of data becomes de facto the curation of reality. And one can produce the other. The curation of data will definitely produce a reality. As Black folks, we know that. As people who live with disability, as people who are not white, able-bodied people, we know the world produces certain choices for us that we would prefer not to be always presented with. But in this whole area of ML and AI and all of these data-driven, the assumption, the de facto unquestionable assumption that whatever the data set says that, and the way it's been curated, is gospel. And so therefore we start from that place rather than starting what I call a conceptual intervention is, no, you've created a reality, which is the curation of another reality that's the imagination of particular kinds of people in a power asymmetry relationship. So now we're dealing with the photocopy of a photocopy and you're trying to tell me it's the original.
Yes,
And
very
so
nice. Yeah.
it's one of the biggest problems we have. Canada research chairs, we have experts who want to tell us we can solve the problem of racism in algorithms. And I'm like, how? By building another algorithm? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, how about the beginning? How about the actual beginning of what problem are we solving? Are we solving an algorithmic problem, or are we digging into a social problem and trying to solve it? And an algorithm may be one of the things we might use when we carefully consider intersecting structural realities. Is that a more accurate portrayal versus the one that I'm often presented with by my peers in the field?
I mean, I think you said that very well. I mean, one of the things that I have my own framework for like auditing algorithms, but one of the things I very carefully vet with any framework, including mine, is does it raise the question of, is this an algorithmic problem in the first place? Is this, or is this just like a solutionism? We're gonna solve this problem with an algorithm. Gosh darn it! For example, the teacher value added model, which I mentioned earlier, about that sort of was a random number generator, sort of assessing teachers' ability, assessing their so-called value added, was based entirely on test scores of students, like once a year. And I love thought experiments, Lana. So I just wanted to, I'll mention that, like, when I heard about this from my best friend, who's a principal in Brooklyn, I was like, that's not even possible. Like, you can't assess a teacher, obviously, with scores, one score for each kid. Like, that's just not, doesn't make any sense. That didn't stop it from being highly high stakes, getting fired, getting bonuses, pushed very hard by the Gates Foundation, I'll add. But it's an algorithm that should never have been built, to your point. Sometimes problems are actually really hard, and they're social and they're difficult. And if you cannot imagine 6 pedagogy experts in a room agreeing on what it means for a teacher to be a good teacher, how can you expect an algorithm to decide what it means for a teacher to be a good teacher? You can't. It's sort of a thought experiment that proves that this is not a problem that an algorithm will solve. And so that's the very first question you have to ask is like, is there an algorithm? Is there an automated, and literally what I mean by that is, there an automated decision-making system that could help us? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is yes. I'm not anti-algorithm, but I am anti-stuffing every single problem into an algorithmic box. And in particular, one of the things I keep saying about the examples I have in my book is that these are almost to a example, difficult conversations that people didn't want to have.
Yeah, and I'm going to continue with that, just kind of jumping back to our thought experiment coming out of Edmonton, which is actually in the real world, is that if you use that test, this venture fails because if the social problems are social problems and have actually, when we think about Alberta and the relationship to Indigenous and Black peoples and the founding of Canada and the ill distribution of power and how severe power asymmetry is in the criminal justice system. And we have reports for various provinces, including Alberta, about how, in particular, Black and Indigenous people and people living with disabilities are negatively affected to the point of fatality This morning on the CBC, they pointed out that when it came for Black and Indigenous people to criminal justice, they are to the order of no less than 5 times negatively affected, leading to fatality. So we're not talking about, as you said, minor stakes. We're talking high stakes. We're talking your life. And
Yep.
we have these systems in health, in social services, and in policing have literally killed Black and Indigenous people, people living with disability, at a high rate consistently since the founding of the country. So we don't even have we just had this random period in the 60s. It's been across time. And so when we think about a venture capitalist and the police services, it makes us wonder if we're even in a constitutional democracy. That's one question I have. Are we even a constitutional democracy when those kinds of forces get together unchecked, unbounded, and then just mix it up together and ask a question of an algorithm and of automation that, by the measure of your test, is probably not that question. That's probably not the right question. And I wanted to kind of go back to this piece because we have contestations and discussions not only in Ontario but across Canada and perhaps in other jurisdictions around the misuse, abuse, and questionable use of EMR and EHR. So electronic medical records and electronic health records. So what's the difference? For folks who aren't in health, your electronic medical record looks more like the file that your doctor pulled out that wrote stuff in it, and your electronic health record actually talks to other records, is more dynamic, and is usually housed within a data ecosystem. And that's just a quick, layman's definition. And so what's being pushed is, rather than examining what's going on with the healthcare system, is let's just put everybody's everything into the EMR, EHR system. So let me get your income, your sexuality, when the last time you did X or Y was, your race, your language. Let's just put that all in there as if they're equally weighted, and they're not. Because if I, as somebody who is Black, speaks to my language, it is differently weighted socially than if I am white and list those things. So the EMR, EHR is being pushed, particularly by physicians who know little about data ecosystems and want to make statements about determinants of health. And I'm going to add a piece for folks that are not from Canada. We are under an increasingly austerity environment. There will be no increase in healthcare expenditures. Healthcare expenditures are being cut, and for some of the most vulnerable people. So the question is, why would you be putting more data into an increasingly privatized system? And please read Weapons of Math Destruction, because the chapter on insurance does apply to Canadians, because in the very near future, you will have to get coverage for all of the things that are being cut under the current administration and are yet to come. And so for me, I'm like, what's the context, right? So if the context you described under propagating inequality is 400 years of inequality, then in this experiment or reality that's happening in Edmonton, are they not actually doing one of the key things that qualifies a weapon of math destruction, which is the scale? You have health, social services, policing at a power asymmetry of the province and the judicial system, whipping up algorithms for social problems that don't fit. So can you talk a little bit about, in Weapons of Math Destruction, you talk about the scale. So if you deal with a racist person or a racist bank, it's at that bank. You might have another chance if you go down the street. But when it's an algorithm, it's the sheer scale of being profiled. Can you go into that a little bit for people that aren't familiar with your book?
Example, I think my favorite example of the scale being such an oppressive force is the story of Kyle Beam, who was bipolar and was trying to get a job, which he was definitely qualified for. It was at Kroger's grocery store in Atlanta. But he had to take a personality test in order to get an interview, and he failed the personality test. The personality test embedded the 5-factor model, which is essentially a mental health assessment. And he was actually lucky enough to recognize that embedded in his personality test. He was lucky in actually a few ways. I mean, he was unlucky because he got red lighted by this personality test and didn't get the job. But he was lucky to recognize that. He was lucky to find out that he had failed that test and therefore didn't get the interview. Most people just never find out why they didn't get an interview. And then he was also lucky because he had a dad who's a lawyer. And his dad looked into it and was like, wait a second, that is illegal under the Americans with Disability Act. So then his dad looked into it some more and said, hey, Kyle, take these, apply for these 6 other jobs. all of them at big box stores. So all of them at chain stores. Applied to all of them, had the same exact test administered to him on the way to trying to get an interview, failed for exactly the same reasons, the 7 times altogether. And so the scale, going back to the scale, is like this one terrible, illegal test prevented him not from just getting that job, but from getting sort of any sort of generic chain store job in the Atlantic area. Not just him, but anybody with bipolar disorder. So in fact, the ADA is trying to prevent the systematic discrimination against people with mental health status from jobs. That's the point of the ADA. That's exactly what was happening with this one crap algorithm. So you see what scale looks like when it's propagated across an entire city or a nation.
And I want to just take this piece here, and this is one of the places where we need to look really closely. So this is part of a larger dialogue around getting ethnicity data, and we have different positions on this, being that it's something that I actually chose to look at fairly closely and study. There's the idea that if you just keep pouring more data, that somehow you can audit it and you're going to get something better, when the first conceptual question hasn't been asked. Is this a question for algorithms? And therefore, is it a question to be audited? And so when we think about ethnicity data, one of the things that our first symposium, and you attended some of it, covered, and we covered extensively through our conversations with Ruha Benjamin and others, Dr. Ocampo, who's a well-respected social epidemiologist, is if you want to study race, then you study race. If you want to study racism, you study racism. But race is not a proxy for racism. So often in Canada, there's this conflation and confusion because people aren't experts in the subject and teasing it out, where they're like, we'll just slap your race on it, bringing back apartheid, and we'll tell you that we're measuring racism. That's how poorly the science is done in this area. So we have people suggesting that let's just add everyone's race and ethnicity. We'll say you're Black, African, of this, and then somehow we'll be able to tell whether people are getting equal healthcare or something else, when really what we want to examine is there equal access? Is racism acting as a barrier? So just to kind of clarify, you can't proxy more proxies in a proxied situation and get clear answers. So can you speak a little bit about, when I was reading Weapons of Math Destruction, there was the piece of scale, but you brought it up here as well in terms of propagation of inequality and the piece around outsourcing accountability, which is that if society, or if people that have the expertise and the power to make right decisions, the law, the Constitution, those kinds of instruments, aren't being engaged fairly, can we just, and I know you've answered this question, but I wanted to bring it back because of the comment, can we just throw ethnicity and race and suggest that we can now find our way to managing racism through algorithms that were never designed to target finding racism and racist equality?
Well, I have to admit that as an algorithmic auditor, it's really helpful to have race information in order to locate inequality, in order to sort of give evidence this is not working. This has disparate impact. And having said that, it's not that simple, right? Like that's the starting point. The hard part, which again, like I keep going back to this, like people use algorithms to avoid difficult conversations. So when I do an algorithmic audit, it's like, hey, let's have that difficult conversation you were trying to avoid. That's what I do. And the number one thing is like, let's get people here who are representing these stakeholders in this conversation, whether that means like customers or clients or targets or insurance or people or patients of these different groups, and say what could go wrong from their perspective. Is that going wrong from their perspective? Like look at it almost like a philosophical thought experiment, because I love thought experiments, like a Rawlsian sort of thought experiment. If, ideally you'd have all those stakeholders represented, but if you, even just before you do, like, what would it mean for them that this is failing? And I keep going back to this in my brain, like these VCs, what does it mean for them for an algorithm to succeed? That's also an important question. It's a flip side of the same thing. The people who control the algorithm, you have to think through that. What would it mean for them that the algorithm is working? And what would it mean for the actual targets of that risk score, which, because it's usually a risk score, for this to work or to fail? And you're going to find out that they're almost totally different worlds. And in particular, for the people who own it, deploy it, and don't want to deal with the harm that they're creating, they like to avoid those questions. So to your point, they probably are saying, well, if we slap the another column with race data, then we are magically somehow solving these problems. Of course, that is complete bullshit. It's the beginning of the conversation to say, okay, well, we've decided, we've talked to people. This is what they're worried about. This is what they're concerned, false positive rate or whatever it is, for Black customers or Black targets or whatever. What is the false positive rate for them versus others? And to answer that question, you do need race data. But that's not the end of that story either. If there is a disparity of false positive rates, what are you going to do about it? Like, how are you going to equalize that? And maybe, and this often happens because ethics is all about trolley problems. For this stakeholder group, false positives are a problem, but for another stakeholder group, false negatives are a problem. And you can't minimize the false positive rate without increasing the false negative rate. That's the thing about algorithms, because they're not perfect. I mean, if they were perfect, then you wouldn't have any false positive or false negatives, but they're never perfect. So you're going to have to balance that. And that's the balance that we are constantly making, either implicitly or explicitly. And the point of an algorithmic audit, the point of having that difficult conversation, is to make that explicit. So it's kind of, I'm agreeing with you, Lana, but I'm also saying that if you're going to have the whole conversation, and ideally you'd have that publicly, with activists at the table, advocates like yourself at the table, then you're going to need to not only have the race data, but have all those tests, have monitors, have ongoing monitors. How's this working now? How's it working in 5 years? Like, let's keep our eyes on this to make sure it's still functioning as well as it needs to.
Yeah, and I wanted to, as we're coming into a close, I wanted to kind of sum up some of the pieces to bring it together. So some of the things we talked about in the description were looking at data grabs from various actors. So in this thought experiments, we're looking at how venture capitalists, how state institutions, and how private companies are all in that mix, because during the pandemic, we have the big six, and I call them all of their relatives, who were once on the ropes and being asked questions, both in the US, Canada, and elsewhere, and now have turned around and repackaged themselves as our saviors. And we've stopped to some degree asking the critical questions. They're still performing the same violations that they were before, but now are being repackaged and sold to us as that these violations are needed in order to stay alive. And these things are being conflated and pressed together. And so it's important that we've pulled them apart a bit to point out that you can address the things that need to be addressed that are social problems. They cannot all be squeezed into algorithms anymore than any other form of automated decision making can, and it will produce challenges that have to be addressed up front, not just after the fact. Also in the description, we talked about data laws and regulations. I pointed out, and we'll talk more about it tomorrow, we've had many of our personal health information regulations and laws stripped down, pared back to make it easier for private ventures to make money off of public investments. And that's something that we'll get into deeper tomorrow, but you heard it here, folks. There are key things that we do need in place in order for these difficult conversations to kind of come out with something meaningful, given the power asymmetries. And also the piece around protecting people's data. One of the key things that we need for protecting people's data are good laws and regulations, so that when people like Cathy can do algorithmic audits, come in and work with companies, they actually have a sandbox that everybody's clear on that they're working in. It's not up to each and every company, each and every public office to decide whatever they want, but that sandbox is constructed by parameters from our Constitution, our Human Rights Code, and what is considered not just ethical, but legal and regulatory. And so also one of the things I wanted to just kind of wrap up with is pointing out that, yes, you can have race-based data, but at the end of the day, the first thing that has to happen is the difficult conversation. And in Canada, we've had a myth sold to us that we don't have sufficient data, but we have lots of StatCans data. We have royal commissions that state, we have a UN report that states the condition of Black people and Indigenous people is deleterious in Canada. So we know where we start. We're past race-based data. We're at the difficult conversation. And the evidence shows that an algorithm can't solve what people have to do. And so we can audit those algorithms, but the question is, what are we building? Who are we building it for? Whose power asymmetry does it maintain? And who continues to be the butt of the process that doesn't work? And so those are the difficult questions. And I thank you so much, Cathy, for coming today. I'm definitely going to have you back. We have lots of questions. There was one quick question before we go. Folks asked, how common is the algorithmic auditing business? Do you want to give a little hint? I don't know a lot of them.
I think I might be the only algorithmic auditor in the business. I know that like McKinsey and IBM and Accenture all have fairness tools, which just between you and me are awful. And I mean, the whole point of a difficult conversation is it has to be, the question you're really asking has to be unbelievably contextual and carefully constructed and tailored. And the point of fairness tools is that they're like one size fit all. They cannot possibly be useful. So yeah, it's the beginning, but it's growing, I hope.
Yes, so do I, and hopefully we'll have a chance to work together in the future. So
Love
folks, I want to remind you that today we talked about data, algorithms, and automation as weapons of math destruction, a mathematician's insight into the implications of AI for equity and universal health care. And what we know is we have some difficult conversations up ahead, and we cannot simply motor through them by developing algorithms. It's not as simple as slapping race and income and language, and somehow people are going to magically figure out what those proxies are for. In fact, we have to start at the beginning, which is with what we know. And that is that we have to negotiate the world that we want for the 21st century. It cannot be automated if we want something different, because only the past can be repeated in the future if we keep down this track. So thanks again, Cathy. Thank you, everybody who took time out to join us today. Take care. We'll see you again soon, tomorrow at 2:30 right here.